The morning I found out my husband had emptied my inheritance account, I was standing in my mother's kitchen holding her old coffee mug. The one with the small chip on the handle that she never threw away because she said broken things still worked. I had driven 3 hours to close out her estate, to sign the last papers, to do the final hard thing a daughter does when her mother is gone. And when I opened the bank notification on my phone and saw a zero where there should have been $240,000, my legs did not move. I did not scream. I did not call him. I just stood there holding that chipped mug and understood in a way that settled deep into my bones that the man I had spent 11 years building a life with had looked at my grief and seen an opportunity. The worst part was not the money. The worst part was that he did it the week of my mother's funeral, while I was too exhausted and too heartbroken to check. And the part after that, the part nobody tells you, was that something far bigger was coming, and it started with a knock at my door from a man I had never met in my life. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honest. If you found out the person you trusted most had taken everything while you were grieving, would you confront them immediately or would you go quiet and start planning? Think about that while you listen, because Nadia's answer to that question is the reason this story ends the way it does. If you're the kind of person who believes that silent strength can be more powerful than a loud argument, stay with this one all the way to the end. It will be worth it. My name is Nadia, and I want to tell you something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not someone who likes to talk about painful things. I am the person in the family who shows up, does the work, handles the paperwork, brings the food, and then drives home alone afterward without saying how tired she is. I have been that person my whole life. My mother raised me to be reliable. She raised me to be calm. She raised me to be the one who holds things together when everything around her is falling apart. And for most of my adult life, I thought that was a strength. I did not understand yet that people who are always reliable become invisible. Not because no one sees them, but because people start to assume they will always be there, always give more, always absorb the hit, and always be fine afterward. I was 38 years old before I understood the difference between being strong and being used. My mother's name was Delia. She was a small woman with a large personality and a very specific way of loving people, which mostly meant she cooked enormous amounts of food and then criticized your life choices while you ate. She was not perfect. She was stubborn. She held grudges too long. She had opinions about everything and she shared them freely. But she worked hard every day of her adult life. She saved carefully and consistently, and she made sure that when she left this world, I would have something solid underneath me. She told me once, sitting at her kitchen table the year she was diagnosed, that she had always worried about me, not because I was weak, but because I was too generous. She said, "Nadia, you give people the best of yourself and then you forgive them for taking it." I did not know what to say to that at the time. I just refilled her coffee cup and changed the subject. She passed in March. It was not sudden. We had 2 years of preparation, of slow goodbye, of learning to say the things you always assumed you had more time to say. By the time the end came, I had already been managing her accounts, organizing her estate documents, communicating with her attorney, and handling every financial and administrative detail of her affairs for over a year. I knew exactly what was in her estate. I knew the numbers. I knew the account. $243,000, saved over 40 years of careful living, left specifically and legally to me. My husband Marcus had known about this money for years. We had discussed it. He knew it existed, he knew its purpose, and he had agreed with me more than once that when the time came, this money would go towards securing our future in a specific way. We had talked about using part of it to pay off the mortgage on our house. We had talked about setting aside a portion for an emergency fund. And I had been clear, always clear, that I wanted to invest a significant portion because my mother had sacrificed too much for that money to be spent carelessly. Marcus had nodded through all of these conversations. He had agreed. He had seemed supportive. I believed him. I married Marcus when I was 27. He was 31. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, meaning he was attentive and enthusiastic at the beginning and gradually less of both as the years passed. He was not cruel to me. He did not raise his voice. He never frightened me. What he did instead was something quieter and harder to name. He borrowed my emotional energy and gave back less and less in return. He made plans and did not follow through. He started projects and abandoned them. He got excited about opportunities that never materialized. Over 11 years, he changed jobs 4 times and started 2 businesses that both failed within 18 months. Each time I adjusted, I took on more freelance work. I managed our budget more tightly. I covered the shortfalls and then told him it was okay because I believed it would get better. I was the chipped mug, still working, still holding. The month after my mother died, I was not fully present in my own life. I do not say that to excuse myself. I say it because it is the truth. I was managing grief and logistics simultaneously, driving back and forth between cities, communicating with her attorney and her bank and her landlord and her utility providers. I was doing all of the things that have to be done when a person leaves the world, and I was doing them while also working part-time and cooking dinners and making sure Marcus had clean shirts. Because that is who I was, that is what I did. I kept moving so I did not have to stop and feel the full weight of what I had lost. Marcus was present enough during those weeks to seem supportive. He came to the funeral, he held my hand during the service, he said the right things to the relatives, he drove me to the attorney's office the day I signed the final estate documents. And then 3 days later, while I made another trip to my mother's old apartment to finish clearing it out, he transferred $243,000 out of the estate account I had just received and into an account I did not know existed. I found out the way people find out things they were never supposed to discover, which is by accident. I was standing in my mother's kitchen packing the last of her dishes when my phone notified me that my linked account had a low balance. I checked it without thinking. I checked it the way you check a familiar thing, expecting to see what you always see, and instead I saw zero. I saw a transfer confirmation dated 3 days earlier. I saw a name on the destination account that was not mine and not ours. I saw my mother's 40 years of careful saving disappear into a line of text on a screen. I put the phone face down on the counter. I picked up her coffee mug, the chipped one I had already set aside to keep, and I held it for a long time. Then I took a very slow breath and I started thinking, not panicking, not crying, thinking because that is what I do when the floor falls away. I get very quiet and I start to figure out what is actually true. I knew two things immediately. The first was that Marcus had not made a mistake. You do not accidentally transfer $243,000 to an account that does not belong to your household. You do not accidentally set up a separate account and then accidentally move your grieving wife's entire inheritance into it 3 days after the estate is settled. That is a series of deliberate decisions. The second thing I knew was that I needed information before I made any move at all. I needed to understand exactly what had happened, where the money had gone, and who else was involved. And I needed to do all of that before Marcus knew that I knew. I drove home, I cooked dinner, I sat across from Marcus at our kitchen table and I watched his face while he talked about his day. He was relaxed. He helped himself to a second serving, he complimented the food, and I smiled and nodded and asked small questions and felt underneath every moment of that meal a kind of cold clarity I had never felt before in my life. This man had looked at my mother's death as a financial window. He had waited for me to be exhausted and distracted and heartbroken, and then he had taken everything she left me, and he had done it carefully enough that he thought I would not find out for a while. He had been planning this. The calm and support he showed at the funeral had been a performance. He was not holding my hand out of love. He was keeping me steady while he emptied my account. After dinner, I said I had emails to finish and I went to my desk. I opened my laptop and I started pulling every financial document I could access. I checked every account, every statement, every linked profile, and what I found in the next 2 hours was worse than I had imagined. The account the money had gone into had been opened 6 months ago, and it was a joint account, not a personal account in Marcus's name alone, a joint account, with a woman named Celeste Harmon. I sat with that name for a very long time. I searched it, I found her, she was real. She had a social media presence, a professional profile, a life that existed entirely outside of mine. She was 34 years old. She lived 20 minutes from the city where Marcus had been traveling for work every third week for the past year and a half. And when I looked more carefully at the pictures on her public profile and the timing of certain events, certain trips, certain weekends when Marcus had been supposedly at industry conferences, I understood the full shape of what had been happening. Marcus was not just stealing from me, he was funding another life. My mother's money, the careful savings of a woman who worked and sacrificed and dreamed of giving her daughter security, was being used to build a financial foundation for my husband and his girlfriend. And he had chosen to do this the week of my mother's funeral because he knew I would be too destroyed to notice quickly. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to a man I no longer recognized, and I thought about every conversation we had ever had about that money. I thought about every time he had nodded and agreed. I thought about his hand holding mine at the funeral service. I thought about my mother at her kitchen table telling me I was too generous. I thought about the chipped mug, still working, still holding. And then, very quietly, I started making a plan. The first thing I did was call my mother's attorney first thing in the morning. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she was a precise, no-nonsense woman who had handled my mother's estate with complete professionalism. I told her what I had found. I sent her the screenshots I had taken the night before. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Nadia, I want you to come in today." I went. I brought every document I had. Patricia reviewed everything and told me clearly that because the inheritance had been transferred directly into an account in my name as the sole heir, and because Marcus had moved it without my signature or authorization, this was not a gray area. This was financial fraud committed against a spouse. She referred me to a colleague who specialized in exactly this kind of case, and by the end of that week, I had a family law attorney named Daniel Reeves reviewing my situation and beginning the process of documenting everything. I did not confront Marcus. Not yet. I know that is hard to understand. I know the instinct is to demand answers immediately, but I had learned something from watching my mother manage difficult situations over the years. She always said that the person who reacts first gives away everything they know. I was not ready to give anything away. I needed more information. I needed documentation. I needed the full picture before I let Marcus know the picture existed. I spent the following 3 weeks living two separate lives. On the surface, I was still Nadia, the wife who cooked dinner and asked about his day and moved through the house without confrontation. Underneath that surface, I was collecting every piece of information I could find. I requested transaction records, I printed statements, I noted dates. I cross-referenced Marcus's travel history with the patterns in the joint account activity, and every day the picture became clearer and more complete. The money had not been sitting in that joint account doing nothing. Marcus had already moved significant amounts of it again. He had paid off a car loan in Celeste Harmon's name. He had made 2 payments toward a lease on an apartment. He had transferred money into what appeared to be an investment account. He had spent a portion on what the receipts I eventually found described as travel and furnishings. My mother's 40 years of careful saving had been converted into a life he was building with someone else. In 3 weeks, he had spent or committed nearly $60,000 of it. It was on a Tuesday evening, 3.5 weeks after I found out the truth, that someone knocked on my front door. Marcus was out. He had told me he had a work dinner. I was at my kitchen table with a folder of documents and a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I heard the knock and thought nothing of it. I opened the door expecting a neighbor or a delivery. The man standing on my front step was not someone I had ever seen before. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with the kind of steady face that comes from a life that has weathered significant things. He was dressed simply and well. He held his hands at his sides. And the first thing he said was, "Is your name Nadia?" When I said yes, he said, "My name is Robert Harmon. I think we need to talk." I do not think I fully breathed for the next several seconds. Robert Harmon, I knew that name. Celeste Harmon's last name. I looked at this man on my front step and I understood immediately who he was. He was the husband of my husband's girlfriend. He was the other person being deceived in this situation, and he had found me. I let him in. I made more tea because that is what I do under pressure. And we sat at my kitchen table, two strangers connected by people who had betrayed us both, and we elked for nearly 2 hours. Robert had found out about Celeste and Marcus approximately 6 weeks before this night, which meant he had known slightly longer than I had. He had hired a private investigator after noticing financial irregularities in their household accounts. The investigator had given him documentation. He had spent weeks consulting with his own attorney and processing what he had learned before deciding to find me. He said he had debated whether to come. He said he understood that arriving at a stranger's door with this kind of information was a significant intrusion. But he also said he believed I had a right to know the full scope of what was happening, and that he had information that was directly relevant to my legal and financial situation. Then he told me something that changed the entire shape of this story. Robert Harmon was not a struggling man trying to recover from a betrayal. He was the founder and majority owner of a regional logistics and supply chain company that he had built over 22 years. He did not say this to impress me. He said it as context for what came next. Celeste had signed a prenuptial agreement before their marriage 8 years ago. That agreement had specific provisions related to infidelity and financial misconduct during the marriage. Because of what Celeste had done, and because of the documented financial activity in the joint account she shared with Marcus, which Robert's attorney had already obtained through legal process, Celeste was going to lose a very significant portion of what she might otherwise have received in any divorce settlement. Furthermore, the money Marcus had transferred into that account and then used to pay off Celeste's car loan and fund the apartment lease was going to become part of a financial recovery action. And because that money was traceable back to me, specifically to my mother's estate, Robert's attorney believed there was a strong legal basis for those funds to be classified as wrongfully transferred marital assets that I had a claim to recover. I sat with all of that information and I tried to organize it. Then I asked Robert the most direct question I could think of. I said, "Why did you come here personally?" He could have had his attorney contact my attorney. He could have handled this entirely through legal channels without ever sitting across from me at my kitchen table. He looked at me for a moment and then he said, "Because I wanted to know what kind of person you were before this was over. And because I thought you deserved to hear this from a real person, not a letter." I did not know what to do with that kind of honesty. I had not experienced very much of it recently. Robert left that evening after we had exchanged contact information for our respective attorneys. He was courteous. He was careful. He did not make any promises and he did not ask anything from me. He simply gave me information, told me he was sorry for what my husband had done, and left. I sat at that kitchen table after he was gone for a very long time. Marcus came home around 10:30. He set his keys on the counter and asked if I was still up. I said yes. He poured himself a glass of water and went to watch television. He had no idea that the entire architecture of his plan had just developed a very serious structural problem. The next morning, I called Daniel Reeves, my family law attorney, and I told him everything Robert had told me. Daniel was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Nadia, if what this man told you is accurate and if his attorney can confirm the documentation they have, then your case just became significantly stronger." He told me that the combination of the unauthorized transfer, the traceable use of those funds, and the financial documentation from Robert's legal proceedings against Celeste could form the basis for both a divorce action and a civil claim for financial recovery that was considerably more solid than what we had been building on our own. The legal process that followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that because the truth of these situations is never a quick montage. It took months. There were filings and responses and hearings and negotiations. There were days when I felt completely exhausted and wondered if the process would ever feel like it was moving. There were nights when I sat alone in my kitchen and missed my mother so much it felt like a physical weight. I had done all of this because she worked so hard and deserved to leave something solid behind for me. And I had lost it and was fighting to get it back, not just for the money, but because letting Marcus keep it would have meant accepting that her sacrifice did not matter. In the middle of all of this, I still had to manage my daily life. I was still working. I was still paying the bills I could see. I had moved some of my personal accounts to an institution Marcus did not have access to on the advice of my attorney. I had also made a personal decision about the house. Our house was in both our names. I had contributed the larger portion of the down payment from savings I had built before we married. My attorney flagged this early, and we began the process of documenting my financial contributions to the property carefully and completely. Marcus did not realize anything was happening for almost 6 weeks after Robert's visit. I was that careful. I moved through the house doing everything I normally did and gave nothing away. I know that sounds cold, and maybe it was, but I had been giving things away for 11 years without being careful about the cost, and I had learned what happened when you gave too much to someone who did not protect what you offered. I was not being cold. I was being deliberate for the first time in a very long time. The morning I filed for divorce, Marcus was at a breakfast meeting. My attorney filed the papers at 9 in the morning. Marcus was served at 11:40 while he was in the parking lot of a restaurant he had once taken me to for our anniversary. I know the timing because his attorney called Daniel's office that afternoon in a state that Daniel described to me later as unusually agitated. Marcus came home that evening in a completely different version of himself than the man I had lived with. The calm was gone, he paced. He said my name in a sharp way I had rarely heard from him before. He asked how I could do this without talking to him first. He said I was overreacting. He said the money was something he had moved to protect it because he had been worried about security in my original account, which was a lie so poorly constructed it did not deserve a response. He said we could work through this. He said he still loved me. He said I was throwing away 11 years. He said every version of the thing that men say when they have been caught and need to slow you down long enough to regain control of the situation. I let him finish, and then I said simply and clearly that I would be communicating through my attorney from this point forward and that he should do the same. Then I went to my room and I locked the door. He knocked twice, then he stopped. That night I called my closest friend, a woman named Priya who had known me since college, and for the first time in months I told someone the full truth of what had been happening. Not the managed version, not the I am handling it version, the real version. And Priya listened to all of it, and when I was done she said, Nadia, I have been waiting for you to leave that man for 6 years. Then she made me laugh for the first time in a very long time. The weeks that followed the filing were some of the hardest of my life and also some of the most clarifying. Marcus's initial strategy appeared to be delay and minimize. His attorney responded to filing slowly. He moved out of the house eventually but made the process of arranging that as complicated as he could. He told mutual acquaintances a version of events that positioned him as the victim of an impulsive decision, which is the strategy of someone who knows the truth would not serve them. What Marcus did not know was how much documentation we had. He did not know about Robert Harmon. He did not know that Robert's legal proceedings against Celeste had already produced a detailed financial record of the joint account and every transaction that had passed through it. He did not know that the car loan payoff, the apartment lease payments, and the investment transfers were all traceable and documented. He had moved my mother's money thinking I would discover it eventually, but that by the time I did the legal situation would be complicated enough to discourage me. He did not know that I had started building my case 3.5 weeks before I let him know I was building anything at all. The thing about quiet people is that silence is often mistaken for passivity. Marcus had watched me absorb things for 11 years, and he had concluded that I would absorb this too eventually. He had badly misread what kind of quiet I was operating from. The mediation sessions were uncomfortable in the way all necessary difficult things are uncomfortable. Marcus arrived at the first one with an attorney who had clearly been briefed to Project Confidence, and he sat across from me with the expression of someone who believes the performance of certainty is the same as actually having ground to stand on. He looked at me and I thought about the night of my mother's funeral and his hand holding mine and how calm he had been. And I felt something settle in my chest that was not anger. It was closer to sorrow for the time I had given him and the clarity that time could not be recovered, only learned from. Our mediator was a careful woman who guided the sessions methodically. When our attorneys presented the financial documentation, including the full record of the unauthorized transfer and the subsequent documented spending, the confidence in Marcus's posture began to shift. His attorney requested adjournments twice. Marcus's version of events changed between the first and second session in ways that were noticeable enough that even the mediator remarked on the inconsistencies carefully and professionally. The civil recovery element, the portion of my case aimed at recovering the funds that Marcus had transferred and spent, was more complicated. Not every dollar was recoverable. Some of what he had spent was gone in a practical sense. But the documentation created by Robert's parallel legal proceedings against Celeste, which established that the funds in the joint account were improperly obtained and partially derived from my inheritance, gave my attorney a foundation to work from that produced a recovery figure that my attorney described as better than typical in situations of this nature. I also want to tell you about the house because the house mattered to me for reasons that were not purely financial. I had chosen that house. I had found it during a Sunday afternoon drive 3 years into our marriage when Marcus was not with me. I had seen the light coming through the front windows and I had felt something that I did not feel very often, which was that I wanted something and it was possible to have it. I had contributed heavily to the down payment, and I had maintained the household finances that kept the mortgage current through 2 of Marcus's periods of unemployment. My attorney built a clear record of those contributions, and the house was ultimately awarded to me in the settlement, with a buyout process structured around its appraised value. The day Marcus signed the final settlement documents was a Thursday in October, 7 months after I had opened that banking notification in my mother's kitchen. He signed without looking at me. His attorney gathered the papers quickly, and then they left, and I sat alone in the conference room for a moment and I thought about my mother. I thought about the chipped mug, still working. I drove home that afternoon and I stood in my kitchen in my house and I made myself a cup of tea. I did not call anyone immediately. I just stood there and let the quiet be what it was, not the quiet of absence or grief or exhaustion, the quiet of something finished, the quiet of something new beginning. Robert Harmon texted my attorney the same day to confirm that his parallel legal process had concluded as well. His divorce from Celeste was finalized. The prenuptial provisions had been enforced. His attorney confirmed that the portion of recovery related to my mother's funds had been handled as agreed between our legal teams. Robert and I had spoken a few more times during the months of the process, not often, not intimately, but when we did speak, I found him to be consistently the same person he had been the first night he stood on my front step. He was direct, he did not exaggerate, he did not perform. He said what he meant and he meant what he said. He had told me early in the process that there was something he wanted to talk to me about once everything was legally concluded, and that he did not want to raise it while the legal situation was active, because he wanted me to make any decisions freely and without feeling any kind of pressure or obligation connected to the case. On a Saturday morning about 2 weeks after the settlement, he called and asked if I would be willing to meet him for coffee at a place convenient for me. I said yes because I was curious. He had been honest with me from the beginning and I had no reason to expect anything different now. We met at a small cafe that I liked with good light and small tables and coffee that was actually worth drinking. He arrived first and was seated when I got there. He stood when I came in, which is a small thing, but it was not a small thing. He asked how I was genuinely before he said anything else, and I told him the honest version, not the managed version. I said I was tired in a way that was also beginning to feel like freedom. He nodded like he understood that exactly. Then he told me what he had wanted to say. Robert's company had grown significantly in the past several years, and he was at a point where he was restructuring the leadership team and bringing in a smaller, more trusted group to manage the business's next phase of development. He had a role he was looking to fill specifically related to financial operations management and estate of client account administration, a role that required someone with organizational intelligence, financial literacy, attention to detail, and integrity. He said he had watched how I had handled a situation that would have broken most people. He said he had seen the documentation my attorney had assembled and he understood how methodically I had worked. He said he was not offering me anything out of sympathy and he was not offering out of obligation. He said he was offering because he believed I was exactly the kind of person he needed in that role, and that I would be doing him a professional favor by considering it. I sat with that for a moment, then I asked him to tell me more about the role. We talked for nearly 3 hours. He described the company, its structure, its current challenges, and what the position would involve. He was precise. He answered every question I asked directly and without spin. By the time we finished our coffee, I had enough information to know that the role was real, the offer was serious, and the work itself was the kind of work I was genuinely suited for. I told him I would think carefully about it and give him an answer within a week. He said that was completely reasonable and that there was no pressure. He paid for the coffee and shook my hand and thanked me for my time, not for the meeting, for my time, specifically, like it had value. I thought about it for a week. I talked to Priya, who used words I will not repeat here but whose position was clear and enthusiastic. I thought about my mother, who had told me I gave the best of myself to people and then forgave them for taking it. I thought about what it would mean to channel the skills I had spent years using to manage other people's chaos into something that was mine. A professional role, a clear identity. A place where my attention to detail and my financial literacy and my organizational intelligence were assets, not just invisible functions that kept a household running. I said yes. I started the job in January, 3 months after the settlement. The work was difficult and absorbing and exactly the right kind of challenge at exactly the right moment. I was good at it, not because Robert had done me a favor, but because I had been building the skills it required for years without having a formal context for them. I was thorough. I caught things others missed. I asked precise questions. I followed up without being reminded. The team I worked with was capable and professional. The environment was nothing like the emotional atmosphere of my marriage, where the same conversations circled endlessly without resolution. This was a place where problems were identified, addressed, and resolved, where the work was taken seriously, where my contribution was visible and acknowledged. The recovery of the inheritance funds, while not complete, was substantial enough that combined with the house settlement, I was in a more secure financial position than I had been in years. I set aside the first portion as my mother would have wanted, placed carefully and wisely. I paid off a debt that had been sitting at the edge of my awareness for too long. I made a plan for the rest that was not impulsive or emotional but clear and measured, the way my mother had taught me by example across a lifetime of careful choices. My relationship with Robert remained professional for a long time after I joined the company. The situation between us was complicated enough by history that neither of us moved toward anything personal, and I was not in a place where I would have welcomed it. I needed time to be myself without being defined by someone else's choices. I needed to know what my days felt like when I made all the decisions. I needed the quiet of my own space and my own thoughts. But I want to tell you one more thing about him because it matters to the full shape of this story. About 9 months after I started working at his company, we were in a team meeting reviewing a set of client accounts, and I flagged an irregularity in a quarterly report that had been prepared by an outside contractor. It was small, easy to miss, the kind of thing that might have gone through unnoticed by someone less careful. But I had noticed it, and I raised it, and when it was investigated, it turned out to be a significant billing error that had been occurring for months. Robert called me into his office afterward, not to congratulate me in a performance, just to say simply that the kind of attention I brought to the work mattered and that he was glad I was there. Then he asked if I had time to review a second set of accounts he had questions about. That was it, that was the whole moment. No fanfare, no grand statement, just honest acknowledgement and then more work. I went back to my desk and I thought about how many years I had spent hoping for something like that from Marcus and never getting it, and how much lighter it felt to receive it without having fought for it. I will not tell you this story has a perfect ending. Life does not produce perfect endings. Marcus eventually moved to another city. I heard through a mutual connection that things with Celeste had not lasted beyond the legal fallout, which surprised no one who understood the nature of what they had built together. I did not feel satisfaction at that. I felt nothing much at all, which was its own kind of conclusion. I still have my mother's chipped coffee mug. It sits on the shelf in my kitchen, and where I can see it every morning. I made a decision early on not to get rid of it and not to keep it packed away. She left it to me like she left everything she had, with the quiet confidence that I would know what to do with it. I think I finally do. There are a lot of things I could have done differently in the years of my marriage. I could have paid closer attention. I could have been less tolerant of patterns I saw and chose to explain away. I could have asked harder questions sooner. I do not spend my time cataloging those missed moments because that kind of accounting does not serve the life I am building now. What I do instead is take the things I learned about watching carefully, about documenting thoroughly, about staying quiet when silence gives you an advantage and speaking clearly when it is finally time to speak, and I carry them forward. My mother told me once that broken things still work. She was talking about her coffee mug, but she was also talking about me, about herself, about the women in our family who had been chipped and tested and still showed up and still held. She was right. Broken things still work, but that does not mean you keep letting someone reach for your shelf without permission. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I woke up early. The house was mine and it was quiet. I made coffee in my mother's mug and I stood at the window in my kitchen and I watched the light come through the way it had the very first time I had seen this house, the light that had made me feel for the first time that I wanted something and it was possible to have it. I stood there for a long time and I thought, this is what it feels like. This is what I worked for. This is what I stayed quiet long enough to reach. I did not need anyone to validate that moment. I did not need applause or recognition or someone else's acknowledgement that it had been hard or that I had handled it well. I just needed the light and the coffee and the truth that I was still here, Still working, still holding, and still choosing, finally and firmly and without apology to hold for myself. My name is Nadia, and I am just getting started. If any part of Nadia's story felt familiar to you today, I want you to sit with that for a moment before you scroll past. There is a difference between staying in a difficult situation because you are working on it and staying because you are afraid of what choosing yourself would cost. Nadia stayed quiet for a long time, but when she moved with every piece of information she needed and not a single wasted emotion. If you have ever been the person who holds everything together while someone else quietly takes from you, leave a comment below and tell me the moment you realized enough was enough. Your story matters here. And if you have not yet reached that moment, I hope this one gives you something to think about.